Kade the Protector. Byron Avon. Kade the Protector. Kade the Protector. Title page, cover. Kade the Protector. Byron Avon. Byron Avon Publishing. All rights reserved.
Kade the Protector.
Kade the Protector. A superhero is born by Byron Avon. Prologue. The birth of a weapon. The Nevada desert stretched endlessly under a merciless sun, its barren landscape broken only by the angular silhouette of Project Aegis, a facility that officially didn't exist. Buried 3 stories beneath the sand and concrete, Dr. Elena Vasquez wiped sweat from her brow as she made final adjustments to humanity's most ambitious creation. Initiating power cells, she announced to the observation deck above. Through reinforced glass, a dozen military officials and scientists watched with predatory anticipation. In the center of the lab stood the Mark I exosuit prototype, 7 feet of gleaming obsidian metal interwoven with pulsing veins of alien crystal. The technology had been reverse engineered from debris found in the Tunguska crater, fragments of something that had traveled impossibly far to reach Earth. "Sir," Dr. Vasquez called to General Morrison, whose weathered face bore the scars of 3 wars. "We need our test subject." The blast doors hissed open, and Staff Sergeant Kade Orion stepped into the chamber. At 32, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had pulled wounded soldiers from burning vehicles and talked suicidal teenagers off bridges. His psychological profile read like a manual for heroism: unbreakable moral compass, pathological need to protect others, and a pain threshold that had impressed even seasoned interrogators. "You sure about this, Doc?" Kade's voice carried a slight Tennessee drawl, softened by years of speaking gently to frightened civilians. "The neural interface will bond with your nervous system," Dr. Vasquez explained, her fingers dancing across holographic displays. "Based on our simulations, you'll have the strength of 100 men, flight capabilities approaching Mach 5, enhanced vision that can penetrate solid matter, and reflexes that approach the speed of light." General Morrison leaned forward against the glass. "In other words, son, we're making you into the perfect weapon." Kade's jaw tightened. "With the respect, sir, I didn't sign up to be a weapon. I signed up to protect people." "Same thing," Morrison replied coldly. As the exosuit opened like a metallic flower, revealing its bio-neural interior, Kade caught Dr. Vasquez's eye. She had designed this marvel, but her expression held deep uncertainty. "What happens to the man inside?" Kade asked quietly. "That," she whispered, "is what we're about to find out." The suit closed around him with a sound like thunder. For a moment, darkness. Then, awakening. Power flooded through every nerve, every cell. Kade felt the weight of mountains in his muscles, the freedom of wind beneath wings he'd never possessed. His vision sharpened until he could count the threads in Dr. Vasquez's lab coat from 50 feet away, then shifted spectrums to reveal the skeletal framework of the facility itself. He lifted his hand, watching energy crackle between his fingers like captured lightning. "Status report?" Morrison barked. Kade's voice emerged amplified, resonant with new authority. "Systems nominal, sir." "But I want to make something clear." He turned toward the observation deck, his enhanced vision piercing the reinforced glass to meet Morrison's eyes directly. "This suit, this power, it won't be used to conquer, only to protect." Morrison's smile was sharp as a blade. "We'll see about that, son." But Kade Orion had already made his choice. In the depths of his enhanced consciousness, a vow crystallized like diamond. "Never again will I stand by while innocents suffer. Never again will power serve anything but protection." He had no idea that within 72 hours, the world would burn, and his promise would be tested in ways that would shatter nations. Act 1, The Awakening. Chapter 1, The Call to Action. The Situation Room screens flickered with real-time satellite footage of Kazakhstan, a small nation torn apart by 3 years of civil war. Cities that had once been cultural jewels now lay in ruins, their ancient minarets reduced to rubble, their markets silent except for the whistle of incoming artillery. "Refugee count is approaching 2 million, Colonel Hayes reported, his voice clinical despite the horror unfolding on screen. "The capital city of Darjek is completely surrounded. Estimated civilian population trapped inside, 300,000. Multiple screens showed the true horror of modern warfare. Hospitals burning under white phosphorus attacks. Schools converted into sniper nests. Children as young as 8 carrying assault rifles through rubble-strewn streets. Chemical weapons had turned entire neighborhoods into toxic wastelands. Kade stood at attention in his dress uniform, the exosuit's neural implants still fresh behind his ears. For the past week, he'd been subjected to endless calibration tests and strategic briefings. He watched children running through bombed streets, carrying wounded siblings on their backs, and felt something burning in his chest. "What's our timeline for intervention?" he asked. General Morrison didn't look up from his intelligence reports. "We're not intervening, Sergeant. Kazakhstan is strategically insignificant. No oil, no rare earth minerals, no geopolitical value." "Sir, there are children." "There are always children, Orion." Morrison's voice carried the weariness of a man who had made peace with necessary cruelties. "We developed this technology to protect American interests, not to play global savior." On screen, a maternity ward collapsed under artillery fire. Doctors and nurses fled into the street, carrying newborn babies while dodging sniper fire. A nurse, barely 20 years old, held 3 infants while blood ran down her face from shrapnel wounds. Kade's enhanced vision zoomed in automatically, reading her lips as she whispered prayers in 3 different languages, one for each baby she carried. "Permission to speak freely, sir?" Morrison finally looked up, noting the dangerous quiet in Kade's voice. "Granted. The suit gives me the power to neutralize that entire siege in under 10 minutes. I could extract those civilians before their next chemical attack. We're watching genocide happen in real time, and we have the power to stop it. And starting World War III in the process." Morrison snapped. "The Russians are backing the government forces. The Republic of Kozland has mercenaries in the region. One American super soldier shows up, and suddenly we're explaining to Congress why half of Eastern Europe is a crater." Dr. Vasquez, who had been silent in the corner, spoke up quietly. "Kade, the suit's long-range capabilities are still untested. We don't know what kind of stress extended combat would place on the neural interface." But Kade was no longer listening. On screen, enemy forces were setting up a massive artillery bombardment aimed directly at the refugee camps outside the city. He could see the heat signatures of thousands of families huddled together in tents, completely defenseless against what was coming. His enhanced hearing picked up Morrison's whispered conversation with an aide. "Deploy him to Syria next month. The oil refineries need protecting, and we can test his capabilities against targets that actually matter." That night, Kade Orion made the most important decision of his life. Chapter 2. Going Rogue. At 0347 hours, every alarm in Project Aegis screamed to life. "Breach in Hangar Bay 7! Dr. Vasquez shouted over the klaxons, her fingers flying across her workstation. "The Mark I is active!" Security footage showed an empty containment unit where the exosuit should have been. Motion sensors tracked something moving through the facility at impossible speed. Ceiling-mounted cameras caught only streaks of obsidian light moving faster than their frame rates could capture. "Lockdown protocols!" Morrison roared. "Activate the electromagnetic pulse generators." Too late. By the time the EMP fields powered up, the facility's main hangar door was already twisted into abstract art, torn apart by hands strong enough to crumple tank armor like paper. High above the Nevada desert, Kade Orion soared through the pre-dawn darkness at Mach 4 and climbing. The exosuit's flight systems felt as natural as breathing. Micro adjustments to wing configuration, power redistribution to thrust vectors, atmospheric pressure compensation. The suit wasn't just worn, it was becoming part of him. His destination lay 8,000 miles away, where hundreds of thousands of people were about to die. Behind him, General Morrison was already on secure channels with the Pentagon, the CIA, and the president himself. By dawn, Kade would be branded a terrorist, a rogue agent, a clear and present danger to national security. But as the sunrise painted the sky gold beneath him, Kade felt something he hadn't experienced since childhood, the absolute certainty that he was doing the right thing. Kazakhstan's airspace appeared on his enhanced HUD 18 hours later. The flight across 3 continents had pushed the suit's endurance systems to their limits, but Kade felt energized rather than exhausted. Power flowed through him like a river of starlight. The war zone spread below him like a vision of hell. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to skeletal frameworks of concrete and rebar. Refugee columns stretched for miles, families carrying everything they owned on their backs. Elderly men pushing wheelbarrows loaded with grandchildren. Women clutching babies while scanning the sky for the next airstrike. But the immediate crisis was unfolding at 3 separate locations simultaneously. the besieged hospital complex where doctors were performing surgery by candlelight while enemy forces prepared a final assault, the school compound where 300 civilians had barricaded themselves against advancing tanks, and the refugee camp where government forces had just released chemical weapons into the wind. Kade's tactical computer calculated that he had approximately 4 minutes before the casualties became catastrophic at all 3 sites. Enemy positions surrounded each location in perfect kill boxes. Snipers in the surrounding ruins, artillery teams on the nearby hillsides, mechanized units rolling into position with enough firepower to level city blocks, and overhead, government helicopters preparing to strafe the evacuation routes. Kade descended like a falling star, moving faster than any weapon system on Earth could track. Chapter 3: Baptism of Fire. The first indication of his arrival was the supersonic boom that shattered every window in a 6-block radius. The second was the sudden, impossible silence as every weapon in the enemy perimeter went quiet. Staff Sergeant Yusuf Hakim had been fighting for the government forces for 3 years, but he had never seen anything like the figure that stepped from the crater in the middle of the street. 7 feet tall, wreathed in energy that made the air itself shimmer, moving with fluid grace that belonged in dreams rather than war zones. "Open fire!" Hakim screamed, but his voice cracked with terror. The response was overwhelming. Bullets from 50 different positions, rocket-propelled grenades from rooftops, mortar shells, tank rounds, and helicopter missiles, all converging on the single armored figure standing calmly in the intersection. The explosions were so intense that they created their own weather system, a mushroom cloud of smoke and debris that rose 3,000 feet into the air. When it cleared, the figure was still standing exactly where he had been, completely unharmed, his armor gleaming like starlight. Kade's enhanced vision cataloged every threat simultaneously. 47 snipers in elevated positions, 12 mortar teams, 83 infantry soldiers, 6 armored personnel carriers, 3 T-90 main battle tanks, 4 attack helicopters, and approximately 2,000 enemy combatants converging on his position from all directions. His tactical computer calculated optimal neutralization sequences in 0.1 seconds. He chose the path that would save the most lives with the minimum necessary force. Moving faster than human eyes could track, Kade became a silver blur of impossible motion. He bounded from rooftop to rooftop, his gauntleted hands crushing rifle barrels and sniper scopes with surgical precision. He didn't strike the soldiers themselves. Instead, he destroyed their weapons and ammunition supplies, leaving them stunned but alive in his wake. The tank commanders, veteran soldiers who had seen every type of warfare, rotated their main guns toward the approaching figure. 3 125mm shells fired simultaneously from point-blank range. Kade caught all 3 projectiles in mid-flight, his enhanced reflexes allowing him to pluck depleted uranium tank rounds from the air like catching baseballs. He gently placed the unexploded shells on the ground beside the now helpless vehicles. "No more," he said quietly, but his voice carried across the entire battlefield. His hands found the first tank's gun barrel and simply squeezed. Metal that had been designed to withstand explosive forces crumpled like paper. He tore the turrets from their housings and arranged them in a neat pile, like a child putting away toys. The helicopters above opened fire with everything they had: chain guns, missiles, rockets. Kade launched himself into the air, moving through the barrage like it was a gentle rain. He landed on the lead helicopter's rotor assembly and carefully dismantled it piece by piece, setting the aircraft down gently in a nearby field before moving to the next one. Within 7 minutes, every piece of military hardware in a 3-mile radius had been neutralized without a single human casualty. But Kade's real work was just beginning. The hospital was first. Dr. Amara Naziri had been operating on shrapnel victims by flashlight when the building began shaking from explosions outside. Now she watched in amazement as a figure in gleaming armor moved through her makeshift operating theater like an angel of mercy. "Doctor," Kade said gently in perfect Arabic, his suit's linguistic processors providing real-time translation. "I need to evacuate your patients." "Is anyone too critical to move?" "The children in the burn ward," Dr. Naziri replied, tears streaming down her face. "7 of them. We don't have the equipment to transport them safely." Kade's response was to carefully lift the entire hospital bed, with its life support systems, IVs, and monitors still functioning. His suit's power core provided clean electricity to keep every machine running while he carried child after child through the air to the safety of an undamaged medical facility 5 miles away. The school evacuation was more complex. 300 civilians, teachers, students, and families who had sought shelter were trapped in a building surrounded by enemy forces. The structure itself was rigged with explosives, set to detonate if anyone attempted to breach the perimeter. Kade's solution was to carefully lift the entire building. Using his suit's maximum strength capabilities, he found the structural support points and slowly, gently raised the three-story school building into the air. Families pressed against windows, staring down in wonder as their shelter rose like a mechanical miracle. He carried the entire building, with everyone safely inside, to a secure location behind friendly lines. The refugee camp presented the gravest crisis. Chemical weapons were already dispersing through the air, chlorine gas that would kill everyone in the camp within minutes. 3,000 people, mostly women, children, and elderly civilians, with no protection and nowhere to run. Kade's response was to become a living hurricane. Flying at supersonic speeds, he created a controlled vortex around the entire camp, using his air displacement to literally blow the chemical clouds away from the populated areas. For 27 minutes straight, he maintained a protective wind barrier, while emergency crews evacuated every single person to safety. By sunset, Kade had saved 4,732 lives, 0 casualties among enemy forces, who found themselves disarmed but otherwise unharmed. But his enhanced hearing was already picking up radio chatter from across the region. Warlords placing million-dollar bounties on the winged demon. Government forces calling in airstrikes from allied nations. His own country's military scrambling nuclear-armed submarines to the region with orders to stop him at any cost. Dr. Vasquez's voice crackled through his comm system. She had managed to establish a secure connection despite the military's best efforts to cut him off. Kade, please. They're mobilizing NATO forces. Morrison has authorization to use tactical nuclear weapons if necessary to stop you. Come home. Elena, he replied quietly, watching families reunite in the safe zones he had created. For the first time in my life, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. He cut the connection and launched himself into the night sky. Below him, in the refugee camps, children were already drawing pictures of a winged figure carrying entire buildings to safety. Artists were painting murals of the Silver Guardian on the walls of damaged buildings. Old men were composing songs about the day hope fell from the sky. The legend of the Protector had begun. But legends, as Kade would soon learn, cast long shadows, and not everyone who sought power was interested in using it to protect the innocent. Act 2, Rising Storm. Chapter 4, The Legend Spreads. 6 months after Darjek, Kade Orion had become a force of nature that governments could neither predict nor control. In Somalia, he had arrived during a warlord siege of a UN refugee camp holding 40,000 displaced families. The attacking force included child soldiers, some no older than 12, driving technicals mounted with heavy machine guns. Kade spent 3 hours carefully extracting each child soldier from their vehicles, disarming them gently, and carrying them to a rehabilitation center before neutralizing the adult commanders. When asked later why he didn't simply destroy the vehicles, he replied, "Those children deserve a chance to choose differently." In Myanmar, 3 army divisions had been pursuing ethnic minorities into the mountains, using helicopter gunships to strafe fleeing families. Kade's intervention lasted 18 minutes, enough time to ground every aircraft by carefully removing their rotor assemblies, disable every tank by lifting them into trees, and create safe corridors for 50,000 refugees to reach the border. The pursuing soldiers found themselves stranded but alive in the jungle, forced to radio for rescue themselves. In Syria, a government offensive against a major city had involved siege tactics designed to starve out civilians. Kade's solution was to establish an air bridge, flying supply runs 24 hours a day for 3 straight weeks, carrying food, medicine, and fresh water to a population of 300,000 people. When government forces tried to shoot down supply planes, they found their anti-aircraft systems mysteriously disabled each night. But perhaps his most legendary intervention occurred in Afghanistan, where a terrorist group had seized control of a girls' school and was threatening to execute the students unless their demands were met. The building was rigged with enough explosives to level 6 city blocks, and the terrorists had made it clear they would detonate if any rescue attempt was made. Kade's approach was surgical precision on an impossible scale. Moving faster than human perception, he entered the building and systematically dismantled every explosive device, neutralized every weapon, and extracted every terrorist. All while the girls continued their lessons, unaware that their salvation was occurring around them at superhuman speed. The entire operation took 4 minutes and 37 seconds. The first indication that anything had happened was when local police found 23 unconscious terrorists neatly zip-tied in the school courtyard and a note that read, "The children are safe. Their education continues." The refugee camps buzzed with stories that grew more fantastic with each telling. Children drew pictures of a metal angel who could carry entire buildings. Elderly men argued about whether he was divine intervention or alien technology. Young mothers sang lullabies about the Sky Guardian who watched over sleeping children even in the darkest nights of war. But in the corridors of power, the reaction was far different. He's destabilizing the entire global order, General Morrison reported to a classified emergency session of the UN Security Council. Every dictator, every military commander, every terrorist cell on Earth now has to factor in the possibility that their operations will be single-handedly neutralized by an individual who answers to no authority except his own conscience. Casualty reports? Demanded the Russian representative. That's the problem, Morrison admitted through gritted teeth. 0. In 8 months of operations across 23 war zones, Sergeant Orion has caused 0 fatalities. He disables, he destroys equipment, he evacuates civilians, but he doesn't kill. Ever. And that's a problem because it's not sustainable. Morrison slammed his fist on the table. He's operating on maybe 2 hours of sleep per week, consuming enough calories to feed a battalion, and pushing that exosuit beyond every safety parameter we established. The man is burning himself out to maintain an impossible moral standard. What Morrison didn't say, what he couldn't say, even in this secure facility, was that Kade's example was spreading. Military units across the globe were reporting unprecedented rates of conscientious objection. Soldiers were refusing orders to fire on civilian areas, citing Orion protocols, their own term for the principle that superior firepower demanded superior restraint. Worse, from the perspective of established power structures, was the emergence of protector cells, informal networks of veterans, aid workers, and civilians who had been inspired by Kade's example to take direct action against injustice. They couldn't fly or lift tanks, but they could document atrocities, evacuate civilians, and provide aid to those caught in conflicts. In a bunker beneath the Ural Mountains, General Alexei Volkov was having his own crisis of command. "Show me the Grozny footage again," he ordered his aide. The holographic display materialized, showing Kade's intervention at a Russian military checkpoint in Chechnya. Chechen separatists had been using human shields, 3 buses full of schoolchildren, to move weapons and fighters through Russian lines. Standard protocol would have been to disable the buses with acceptable casualties. Instead, Kade had appeared like a silver ghost, moving faster than cameras could track. In 43 seconds, he had extracted all 127 children from the buses, neutralized the separatists' weapons, and deposited the students safely at 3 different schools, leaving the bewildered fighters standing empty-handed in the middle of a checkpoint, holding nothing but their confused principles. "Sir," his aide ventured carefully, "perhaps we could..." "Could what?" Volkov's voice was ice. "Negotiate with him? Recruit him? He's already refused 7 different monetary offers, 3 separate threats against people he cares about, and 2 attempts at diplomatic immunity." The general paused, studying intelligence photographs of Dr. Vasquez under surveillance. "There is only one solution to the Orion problem. Sir, we build our own. But we do it right this time. No moral constraints, no emotional weakness. A weapon that understands that true peace can only be achieved through the absolute application of superior force." Volkov turned to a file marked Project Doomsday and opened it to reveal psychological profiles, technical specifications, and a photograph of a man he had once served with in Afghanistan, a soldier who understood that sometimes saving civilization required the will to burn it down first. Colonel Marcus Dumil, a man whose nickname among his troops had been Colonel Doom, not for his pessimism, but for his willingness to deliver judgment against those who threatened innocent lives. Chapter 5. The Villain Emerges. Dr. Marcus Dumil had been Kade's commanding officer during their deployment in Afghanistan, back when wars were simpler and enemies wore uniforms. He had also been the man who recommended Kade for the Aegis program, calling him the finest soldier and the finest human being I've ever had the privilege to command. Now, as he stood in the testing chamber of a converted naval base in the Arctic Ocean, Dumil, known to his men as Colonel Doom, represented everything Kade had feared the exosuit technology might become. The Mark II prototype was a machine built for intimidation and absolute dominance. Where the Mark I was sleek obsidian designed for speed and precision, the Mark II was brutal gunmetal gray, bristling with weapon systems and powered by a hybrid reactor that sacrificed efficiency for raw destructive output. Most critically, it had been designed without the neural safeguards that prevented psychological corruption. The Russian designers wanted a weapon that could make the hard choices that compassion would prohibit. "Are you certain about this path, Colonel?" Dr. Franz Weber, the project's lead scientist, adjusted his glasses nervously. The psychological modeling suggests that prolonged use of the Mark II could result in severe personality alterations, God complex manifestation, and complete empathy suppression. Dumil sealed himself into the suit's cockpit. Unlike Kade's seamless integration, the Mark II required its operator to remain distinctly separate from the technology. Dr. Weber, empathy is a luxury that ends wars slowly. Decisive action is what ends them permanently. Power flooded through the Mark II systems, but Dumil felt none of the transcendent connection that Kade had described. Instead, he experienced pure, distilled authority, the ability to impose his will on a chaotic world through superior force. The clarity that came with accepting that some problems could only be solved through the calculated application of overwhelming violence. It felt magnificent. Sir, Weber continued, we've received intelligence that Orion is currently operating in the Kashmir region. If you're determined to confront him, I'm not going to confront him, Dumil interrupted, his amplified voice carrying new harmonics of controlled menace. I'm going to demonstrate what actual leadership looks like when moral constraints don't interfere with practical solutions. Colonel Doom's first demonstration took place in the Central African Republic, where 4 different armed factions had been fighting over diamond mines while using child soldiers and systematic rape as weapons of war. The conflict had displaced over 2 million people and had resisted every attempt at peacekeeping for nearly a decade. Unlike Kade's surgical interventions, Dumil's approach was comprehensive and terrifying. He descended from orbit like a tungsten meteor, his suit's weapon systems painting targets across the entire region. But instead of simply disabling equipment, Dumil made examples. The first militia commander, who refused to surrender, found his entire compound reduced to glass by concentrated particle beam fire, with the commander himself vaporized instantly as a demonstration of the consequences of resistance. The message was received immediately. In 6 hours and 17 minutes, every armed faction in the region had surrendered unconditionally. Child soldiers were disarmed and transported to rehabilitation centers. War criminals were identified, captured, and delivered to international tribunals. Refugee camps were established with the understanding that any attempt to harm civilians would result in immediate and lethal retaliation. The violence stopped completely, but the method of achieving peace left the civilian population in a state of terrified compliance rather than grateful liberation. Attention all combatants! Dumil's voice had boomed across the region through every radio frequency simultaneously. This conflict is now terminated. Any individual found carrying weapons within this territory will be eliminated. Any military unit that attempts to re-enter this region will be eliminated. Any government that challenges this decree will find their leadership under direct threat. The footage was global news within hours. Unlike Kade's carefully documented rescues that inspired hope, Dumil's intervention felt less like salvation and more like conquest. He had ended a decade-long conflict in less than a day, but through intimidation and the demonstrated willingness to kill, rather than through the inspiration to be better. When reporters managed to reach the region, they found civilians who were grateful for the peace, but terrified of the method by which it had been achieved. He was like the hand of God, one elderly farmer told a CNN correspondent. But God's judgment is terrible to behold. We have peace now, yes, but it is the peace of the grave, where no one dares to move for fear of disturbing the dead. The interview was broadcast worldwide at exactly the same moment that Kade was pulling survivors from a typhoon in the Philippines, working alongside local rescue teams with the careful gentleness that had become his trademark, singing lullabies in Filipino to calm frightened children as he carried them to safety. The contrast was impossible to miss, and the world was beginning to choose sides. Chapter 6. The Emotional Core. Kade found them in the ruins of a bombed-out orphanage in eastern Ukraine. 23 children ranging in age from 4 to 16, led by a girl named Katya, who couldn't have been more than 14 herself. They had been living in the basement for 6 weeks, surviving on rainwater and whatever scraps Katya could scavenge during the brief lulls between artillery barrages. The building above them had been struck by cluster bombs, weapons specifically designed to kill children by looking like toys. Katya had lost her left hand to one of the bomblets while searching for food, but she continued to care for the younger children with fierce determination. When Kade descended through the collapsed roof, moving with exaggerated slowness to avoid frightening them, the youngest child, a boy named Alexei, who reminded him painfully of his brother David, looked up with eyes that held too much understanding of the world's cruelty. "Are you here to save us?" Alexei asked in broken English, his small hand clutching a teddy bear that was missing both arms and one eye. Kade knelt carefully, his enhanced suit automatically adjusting its voice modulation to sound less intimidating. "Yes, but I need to ask you something first. Are you brave enough to fly?" Alexi's response shattered something in Kade's carefully constructed emotional armor. I'm not brave. But Katya says being scared and doing it anyway is the same thing as being brave. She says that's what heroes do. Over the next 3 hours, Kade evacuated all 23 children to a safe facility in Poland. But the complexity of their trauma became clear during the flights. 7-year-old Nina refused to let go of a photograph of parents she hadn't seen in 4 months. 10-year-old Pavel had developed a stutter so severe he could barely speak. 12-year-old Sofia had been caring for twin infants who weren't even her siblings, but whom she had found crying beside their dead mother. Each child carried not just their own pain, but the weight of protecting others, even younger than themselves. But it was Alexei who broke Kade's heart completely. As they soared over the Polish countryside, the boy looked up at Kade's faceplate and said, "My brother used to carry me like this, before the airplane came and took him to heaven. Are you going to take me to heaven too?" "No," Kade said gently. "I'm taking you somewhere safe on Earth, where you can grow up and maybe, someday, help other children the way Katya helped you." When they landed safely, Alexei looked around at the clean facility, the warm beds, the abundance of food, and asked the question that would haunt Kade forever. "Will you come back? For the other children? There are so many other children." "Yes," Kade promised. "I'll always come back." But even as he spoke the words, Kade felt the weight of their impossibility crushing down on him. He was one man trying to hold back an ocean of suffering. For every child he saved, 10 more were orphaned. For every war he interrupted, 3 new conflicts erupted. The exosuit gave him the power of gods, but gods, he was learning, were defined as much by what they couldn't do as by what they could. That night, as he rested in an abandoned factory, Kade found himself talking to Dr. Vasquez through their encrypted channel. "Elena, I keep thinking about something Alexei said, about being scared and doing it anyway." "Kade, you saved tens of thousands of lives. You've ended conflicts that could have killed millions. Why do you sound like you're carrying the weight of the world?" Through his enhanced senses, Kade could hear the sounds of distant artillery, air raid sirens in 6 different cities, the cries of children separated from their parents in displacement camps across 4 continents. The exosuit's global monitoring systems painted a real-time map of human suffering that never stopped updating, a constant stream of conflicts, disasters, and crises that human beings were inflicting on each other. "Because I'm carrying the weight of the world," he said quietly. "And I'm starting to understand that no one was ever meant to carry it alone. But I also don't know how to stop trying." Halfway around the world, in his Arctic base, Colonel Dumil was monitoring the same global feeds. But where Kade saw overwhelming responsibility, Dumil saw opportunity and inefficiency. "The problem with Orion," he explained to Dr. Weber, "is that he's trying to save everyone. But real leadership requires making hard choices about who deserves to be saved and who doesn't. He wastes time and resources on lost causes, while greater tragedies unfold elsewhere." Dumil's tactical display showed global conflict zones overlaid with efficiency calculations, casualty prevention per hour, resource expenditure versus lives saved, probability matrices for long-term conflict resolution. "Look at this data," Dumil continued, pointing to the holographic projections. "While Orion spent 3 hours evacuating 23 children from Ukraine, 400 people died in ethnic cleansing in Myanmar, 1,200 were killed in terrorist attacks across 3 different countries, and an entire Sudanese village was wiped out by militias. His compassion is actually causing more deaths by preventing him from making optimal strategic choices." Dr. Weber shifted uncomfortably. "But sir, those children were statistically insignificant." Dumil cut him off. "In the time it takes to save one child properly with Orion's methods, I can end entire conflicts and prevent thousands of future casualties. The mathematics are clear. Controlled brutality prevents greater suffering. Colonel Doom's next intervention would prove his point in the most brutal way possible and force Kade to confront the hardest question of all. Was there a level of suffering so vast that even heroes might have to choose who lives and who dies?" Chapter 7. The Lowest Point. The crisis began with what intelligence analysts would later call the perfect storm of human evil. In a coordinated campaign that had been years in the planning, terrorist organizations across 7 different countries launched simultaneous attacks designed to maximize civilian casualties and media impact. The timing was precise, calculated to spread global resources too thin for effective response. In Mumbai, suicide bombers had seized control of 6 schools and were threatening to execute the children one by one until their demands were met. In London, Gas attacks on the underground had trapped thousands of people in toxic tunnels with no way out. In Tokyo, a nuclear power plant had been compromised and was approaching critical meltdown. In New York, terrorists had taken control of a hospital full of newborn babies. In Sao Paulo, a dam had been bombed and millions were in the path of the flood. In Cairo, chemical weapons had been released in the market districts. In Sydney, the Opera House was rigged with enough explosives to level half the city. Each crisis required immediate intervention. Each had a countdown timer measuring in minutes, not hours. And each was specifically designed to exploit the psychological weakness that made heroes hesitate, the absolute requirement to save everyone. Kade's enhanced processing systems calculated the terrible mathematics. Even moving at maximum speed, he could only reach 3, maybe 4 of the locations before the deadlines expired. Choosing to save 6,000 people in one place meant accepting the deaths of 50,000 in another. For the first time since putting on the exosuit, Kade Orion faced the possibility of failure on a scale that would haunt him forever. He chose Mumbai first. The children were always the priority. His arrival shattered windows for miles as he broke the sound barrier at low altitude, but the terrorists were ready for him. The moment his heat signature appeared on their sensors, they began executing hostages. Winged Demon, the terrorist leader's voice boomed through hijacked television broadcasts. For every minute you spend here, children die elsewhere. You cannot save them all. Kade moved through the school like a silver whirlwind, but the terrorists had learned from studying his previous interventions. They had scattered throughout the building, using the children as human shields, rigging explosives to deadman switches that would detonate if they were rendered unconscious. By the time he had secured the Mumbai schools, precious minutes had elapsed. In London, the gas attacks had claimed their first victims. In Tokyo, the reactor temperature was approaching critical levels. Kade launched himself toward Tokyo at maximum speed, pushing his suit's propulsion beyond safe limits. The flight across the Pacific took 18 minutes, during which people were dying in 6 other locations. The nuclear plant required delicate work. Moving too fast might compromise containment systems. Working too slowly meant meltdown. Kade spent 47 minutes carefully repairing damaged cooling systems and containment barriers, while his enhanced hearing picked up radio reports from the other crisis zones. London, death toll climbing. New York, first baby murdered on live television. Sao Paulo, dam breach imminent. Cairo, chemical dispersal spreading. Sydney, terrorist deadline approaching. By the time Kade finished preventing nuclear disaster, it was too late for Sao Paulo. The dam burst, sending a wall of water through populated areas. He arrived in time to save thousands, but not in time to save them all. Bodies floated in the muddy water. Families who had died waiting for salvation that came too late. He pulled survivors from the flood for 6 hours, his enhanced suit calculating that each person he saved meant someone else in London, or Cairo, or Sydney who would die before he could reach them. The final tally was the worst day in Kade's career as the Protector. 47,000 people saved across 7 different crisis zones, but 23,000 dead because even superhuman speed couldn't overcome the mathematics of coordinated evil. The global media response was immediate and brutal. News networks played footage of Kade pulling bodies from floodwater while simultaneously broadcasting the terrorist leader's final message. You see? Your protector is just a man in a fancy costume. He cannot save everyone. He cannot even save most. He chooses who lives and who dies based on his own arbitrary moral code, and thousands die because of his limitations. But the worst response came from Colonel Dumille, broadcasting from his Arctic base to a world in mourning. This tragedy was preventable, he announced, his gray armor gleaming under harsh studio lights. A single decisive strike against the terrorist command structure would have ended all 7 crises simultaneously. Instead, we watched a bleeding heart play superhero while thousands died unnecessarily. Dumille's tactical display showed the mathematical precision of his alternative approach. I would have identified the Central Command Authority coordinating these attacks and eliminated them in the first 30 seconds. No negotiations, no mercy, no moral constraints. Every terrorist cell involved would have been neutralized immediately, saving all 70,000 lives instead of just 47,000. The broadcast continued with security footage of Dumille's previous interventions. Conflicts ended through overwhelming force and the demonstrated willingness to kill anyone who threatened innocent lives. This is what real protection looks like, Dumille concluded. Not this pathetic performance where good intentions replace practical solutions. The world deserves a protector who understands that sometimes saving civilization requires the courage to destroy those who would tear it down. For the first time in his career as the Protector, Kade found himself facing a global crisis of confidence. Online forums debated whether his moral constraints had caused the deaths. Military analysts published papers on the Orion paradox, the way that absolute moral purity could lead to greater suffering than calculated brutality. Most devastating of all were the survivors themselves. In interviews with families who had lost loved ones, some began asking the terrible question: if the Protector had been willing to kill the terrorists immediately, would my daughter still be alive? That night, sitting in the ruins of what had once been a Brazilian family's home, Kade called Dr. Vasquez. Elena, his voice was broken, mechanical from exhaustion. I think Dumil might be right. I think I've been so focused on keeping my hands clean that I've let others get blood on theirs. Kade, you saved 47,000 people. And 23,000 died because I wasn't fast enough, wasn't ruthless enough, wasn't willing to make the hard choices that would have ended this before it started. There was a long pause. Maybe the world needs Colonel Doom more than it needs the Protector. The connection went dead. For the first time in 8 months, the sky above a crisis zone was empty of silver light. The Protector had not just failed. He had begun to doubt whether protection without the willingness to destroy was just another form of enabling evil. Act 3. The Final Stand. Chapter 8. The Rallying Cry. In a refugee camp outside Jordan's capital, Hassan, now 9 years old and fiercely protective of the younger children, was teaching them how to fold paper airplanes when the emergency broadcast began. The armored figure, known globally as the Protector, has not been seen for 5 days following the coordinated terrorist attacks, the BBC correspondent reported. Colonel Marcus Dumil, operating what appears to be a more advanced version of the same technology, has issued an ultimatum to world leaders. The screen switched to footage of Colonel Doom floating above the United Nations building in New York, his gray Mark II suit bristling with weapons that made the surrounding military forces look like children's toys. I am Colonel Marcus Dumil. His amplified voice boomed across the city. You know me as Colonel Doom. I am offering the world a simple choice. Accept efficient protection through controlled force or continue to suffer the consequences of moral weakness disguised as heroism. Hassan, surrounded by children from 12 different war zones, stood up from his paper airplane project and walked to the communal television. The other children followed. Refugees from Syria, Somalia, Myanmar, Ukraine, and conflicts that most adults couldn't even name on a map. Where is he? Whispered 6-year-old Amira, a Syrian girl who had been rescued from Aleppo. Where is the Sky Guardian? Hassan's answer carried the absolute certainty that only children possess. He's coming back. He promised he would always come back. But maybe he needs to remember who he is. What happened next would be studied by sociologists for decades, a movement that began with children in refugee camps and spread through social media, news networks, and word of mouth faster than any government could track or control. They called it the Light the Sky Project. In every city where Kade had intervened, people began creating massive ground displays visible from high altitude. Portraits of the Protector made from reflective materials, white stones, solar panels, even mirrors angled to catch sunlight. Refugee families painted his symbol on the roofs of their shelters. School children in countries that had never seen war drew pictures and held them up to news cameras. But the most powerful responses came from those who had been saved by his interventions. Dr. Amara Naziri, the doctor from Darjek whose patients had been evacuated during surgery, recorded a video message that was viewed 60 million times in the first 8 hours. I have spent my life in war zones, and I have seen what happens when good people do nothing in the face of evil. But I have also seen what happens when someone with the power of gods chooses to kneel beside children and promise them they are safe. That choice, not the technology, not the strength, but the choice to be gentle when you could be terrible, is what made him a hero. The video showed her working in a new hospital that had been built specifically to treat war-traumatized children, funded by donations from people around the world who have been inspired by Kade's example. Heroes don't abandon the world when it becomes too heavy to carry. They ask others to help them carry it, and we are here, ready to help carry it with him. Similar messages poured in from around the globe. Katya, the Ukrainian teenager who had protected the orphans, now running a program to train other children in conflict zones how to lead and protect each other. The Somali families whose children had been saved from warlords, now working as peace mediators in their region. The Filipino survivors of the typhoon rescue, now trained as emergency responders, helping other disaster victims. But perhaps the most significant response came from an unexpected source: soldiers. Videos began surfacing of military units around the world laying down their weapons rather than follow orders that would harm civilians. In Yemen, an entire Saudi squadron turned their planes around rather than bomb a wedding party. In Myanmar, 3 army divisions abandoned their posts and began distributing food to the villages they had been ordered to destroy. In Syria, Russian soldiers defected en masse and established safe corridors for refugee evacuation. Each video ended with the same phrase, "For the Protector, until he returns." For the choice to be better than we have to be. The movement reached its crescendo when Alexei, the Ukrainian boy who had asked about going to heaven, appeared on every major news network simultaneously. Now, living safely in Poland, but working with an aid organization that helped other war orphans, he spoke directly to the cameras. "I met the Sky Guardian when I was very small and very scared. He could have carried me anywhere in the world in just a few minutes, but he didn't take me to the fanciest safe place or the richest country. He took me to people who would love me and teach me how to help other children like me." Alexei held up a drawing he had made, not of Kade in his gleaming armor, but of Kade kneeling beside a child, his helmet off, showing a human face full of compassion. Colonel Doom says the Sky Guardian is weak because he won't kill bad people. But I think Colonel Doom doesn't understand what strength really is. Strength is being able to hurt someone, but choosing to help them instead. Strength is being scared, but doing the right thing anyway. Strength is carrying children to safety when you could be doing important grown-up things. The 9-year-old looked directly into the camera, his eyes bright with the kind of hope that can only survive in children who have seen the worst of the world and still believe in the possibility of better. Sky Guardian, if you're watching this, please come home. We need you to show us again how to be strong the right way. We need you to teach Colonel Doom that being a hero isn't about winning fights. It's about making sure the people who can't fight for themselves don't have to. The broadcast reached Kade as he sat in the ruins of a church in Afghanistan, his damaged exosuit barely functional, his body pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. Dr. Vasquez had managed to reestablish communication and was streaming the footage to his helmet display. He watched Hassan teaching younger children how to stand up to bullies without becoming bullies themselves. He saw Katya organizing teenage refugees to protect children even younger than themselves. He read messages from soldiers who were risking court-martial to uphold principles he had inspired. But it was Alexei's words that finally broke through his despair. Strength is being able to hurt someone, but choosing to help them instead. "Elena," he said quietly, "patch me through to every news network on Earth. It's time to remind the world and myself what heroism actually means." "Kade, your suit's operating at 20% efficiency. The neural interface is showing stress fractures. If you push it much further, we could be looking at permanent damage. I know, but I'm not going back to fight Colonel Doom because my suit is stronger. I'm going back because I finally understand something I should have learned from the beginning." Kade stood slowly, his exosuit servos whining in protest. Through the broken window of the church, he could see the mountains where he had once served as a simple soldier, back when the distinction between right and wrong had seemed clearer. "What's that?" Elena asked. Being a hero was never about being perfect. It was never about saving everyone. It was never about having all the answers or making all the right choices. Kade looked up at the stars, where a silver streak was moving too fast to be an airplane, too controlled to be a meteor. Being a hero is about choosing to try, even when you know you might fail. It's about inspiring others to try too. And it's about understanding that the most important battles aren't won with superior firepower. They're won by proving that there's a better way to be human. Kade launched himself into the sky, his damaged exosuit trailing sparks and system errors. Behind him, painted in silver stones on the church courtyard, children had spelled out a message in English, Arabic, and Pashto. "Heroes choose hope." He was no longer flying toward a confrontation to save the world from Colonel Doom. He was flying toward the recognition that heroism was not a burden carried by one person, but a choice available to anyone willing to be better than they had to be. The final battle would not be between 2 men in powered armor. It would be between 2 philosophies of power, with the entire world watching to see which one would shape the future of human civilization. Chapter 9, The Battle of Titans. Mumbai at dawn was a city preparing for war. Colonel Dumil had given the world's governments 72 hours to accept his protection protocols, a comprehensive system that would place all military forces under his direct command and establish efficiency zones where conflicts would be resolved through overwhelming force rather than negotiation. The alternative, he had made clear, was a demonstration of what happened to cities that refused practical solutions to their security problems. 16 million people had been evacuated from Mumbai, But unlike the previous crisis, this time the evacuation was voluntary. Thousands of families had chosen to stay, painting silver symbols on their homes and gathering in the streets with candles, forming human chains that spelled out messages of defiance visible from orbit. We choose hope. Heroes don't conquer. Protect, don't control. As Kade descended from the morning sky, his damaged exosuit catching sunlight like a falling star, he saw them. Hundreds of thousands of people who had chosen to stand with him rather than flee to safety. Not because they believed he was invincible, but because they believed what he represented was worth the risk. But the city was not undefended by conventional forces. Every military in the region had responded to Dumil's ultimatum by converging on Mumbai with everything they had. The harbor bristled with warships. The sky was filled with fighter jets. The streets were lined with tanks and artillery pieces, a massive display of coordinated military power that would normally be enough to deter any rational aggressor. Colonel Doom regarded it all with the contempt of a god observing children playing with toy soldiers. He was waiting at the Gateway of India Monument, his gray Mark II suit hovering motionless above the ancient stones, weapon systems powered but not yet targeted. Around him, the very air seemed to vibrate with barely contained destructive potential. Kade, Dumil's voice boomed across the empty harbor as the Protector landed on the monument's base. You came back. I wasn't certain you would, after your failure cost 23,000 lives. I came back because I realized something, Marcus, Kade replied, his damaged suit systems painting warning indicators across his vision. Those 23,000 people didn't die because I wasn't ruthless enough. They died because evil exists in the world, and sometimes evil wins battles. But that doesn't mean we have to become evil to fight it. Sentiment, Dumil replied, his weapon systems coming online with mechanical precision. The luxury of idealists who would rather feel good about their methods than actually solve problems. Look around you, Marcus. Kade gestured at the crowds of people filling the streets despite the danger. The ships in the harbor flying flags from dozens of different countries. The fighter pilots who had volunteered for what everyone knew was likely a suicide mission. This isn't sentiment. This is what happens when people choose to believe there's a better way. The battle began not with violence, but with demonstration. Dumil's first attack was directed not at Kade, but at the assembled military forces, a controlled electromagnetic pulse that disabled every electronic system in a 10-mile radius, ships dead in the water, planes falling from the sky, tanks reduced to expensive paperweights. In 3 seconds, he had neutralized the combined military might of 7 different nations without killing a single person. You see? Dumil called out, his suit speakers amplifying his voice across the city. This is what actual protection looks like. Decisive action that ends threats before they can cause casualties. But instead of surrender, something unexpected happened. The disabled military forces began organizing rescue operations. Navy crews abandoned their powerless ships to help civilians evacuate coastal areas. Pilots whose jets had crashed climbed from their wreckage and began coordinating ground-based defenses. Tank crews emerged from their disabled vehicles and started directing traffic to help families reach safety. They're not giving up, Kade observed, dodging Dumil's particle beam attack. You've taken away their weapons, but they're still trying to protect people. Because they're fools who don't understand that protection requires the willingness to destroy those who threaten the innocent, Dumil snarled, his next attack carving a 20-foot groove through the monument's stone. Kade's response was not to counterattack, but to focus on protection. As Dumil's missiles streaked toward the crowds of civilians, Kade intercepted everyone, his damaged system struggling to match the Mark II's overwhelming firepower. He couldn't match Dumil's destructive capability, but he could ensure that none of that destruction reached innocent people. You see the fundamental flaw in your philosophy? Dumil taunted as his energy weapons forced Kade to take cover behind a collapsing building. You're so busy protecting people from the consequences of their choices that you can't focus on eliminating the threats that require those consequences. They fought through the city's empty districts, their battle painting streaks of silver and gray light across Mumbai's skyline. But where their previous encounter had been about superior firepower, this battle was about superior purpose. Dumil's attacks were designed to force Kade into impossible choices, save the civilians or stop the weapon threatening even more civilians. Each move calculated to prove that moral constraints were just another way of losing. But Kade had learned something in his months of despair. He wasn't fighting alone. Across the globe, the people he had inspired were taking action. Not superhuman action. They couldn't fly or lift tanks or move faster than light. But human action, multiplied by millions. In refugee camps, children were painting pictures of hope and sending them to news stations. In military bases, soldiers were refusing orders that would harm civilians, choosing court-martial over compromise. In government offices, officials were working to establish humanitarian corridors and peace negotiations instead of escalating conflicts. Most importantly, in Mumbai itself, the civilians who had chosen to stay were not passive victims waiting for rescue. They were actively helping, using mirrors to blind targeting sensors, providing real-time intelligence on Dumil's position, even creating human shields around the most vulnerable evacuation sites. The Mark I's neural interface, damaged though it was, carried echoes of every act of courage being performed in his name. Hassan teaching other children to be brave. Katya organizing teenage refugees to protect younger ones. Alexei working with aid organizations to help war orphans. Soldiers around the world choosing conscience over career. Power flowed into Kade's systems, not technological power, but something deeper. The absolute certainty that courage was contagious, that heroism multiplied when it was shared, and that the most powerful weapon against evil was not superior firepower, but the refusal to let evil define the terms of engagement. Dumil's next attack should have ended the fight. A point-blank energy discharge that overloaded Kade's remaining systems in a cascade of sparks and failures. The Mark I's power core went critical, its alien technology screaming as decades of accumulated damage finally pushed it beyond operational limits. But instead of shutting down, something extraordinary happened. The exosuit began to transform. Kade had always thought the technology was separate from him, something he wore, something he controlled. But the neural interface had been changing him on a cellular level for months, just as he had been changing it through his choices and his refusal to use its power for destruction. Now, faced with the choice between saving himself and saving others, Kade made the same choice he had always made. He chose others. The Mark I's technology didn't just fail, it transcended. Instead of containing power, it became a conduit for something that had never been seen before. The fusion of alien technology and human determination, enhanced not by the will to destroy, but by the absolute commitment to protect. Light erupted from Kade's position, not the harsh glare of energy weapons, but something warm, golden, alive. It spread outward from his location like a sunrise, touching every person in the city, every soldier in the harbor, every civilian who had chosen to stand rather than flee. When the light faded, Dumil's Mark II lay in pieces around the monument, not destroyed by superior firepower, but disassembled by something that transcended the logic of weapons entirely. The recognition that power used in service of protection would always be stronger than power used for control. Dumil himself sat on the monument steps, his gray armor gone, looking up at Kade with something that might have been wonder or might have been fear. "How?" he whispered. Kade's own exosuit was gone as well, dissolved into light and memory, and the recognition that the technology had never been what made him strong. He knelt beside his former commander, wearing nothing but his torn flight suit, looking more human than he had in months. "Because I finally understood what you never could, Marcus. Power doesn't make you strong. The choice of how to use power makes you strong. And choosing to protect instead of control, to inspire instead of intimidate, to hope instead of despair, those choices don't make you weaker. They make you part of something bigger than yourself." In the distance, the sound of approaching aircraft, not military strikes, but rescue helicopters and transport planes bringing aid to the city. The crews were volunteers, people from around the world who had been inspired by the example of ordinary citizens choosing to stand up to power that sought to control rather than protect. Chapter 10. Tears of Joy Ending. 2 years later, Hassan was teaching a mixed group of Syrian and Ukrainian refugee children how to build solar panels when he saw the familiar figure walking up the hill toward New Haven Community Center. The man was taller than Hassan remembered, his hair more gray, his face lined with experiences that had aged him beyond his years. But the eyes were the same, blue as sky, kind as morning, carrying the weight of the world, but not crushed by it. "Kade?" Hassan dropped his tools and ran, the way children run towards someone they trust completely. Kade caught him in a hug that lifted the boy's feet off the ground. "Hello, Hassan. I told you I'd always come back." "Where's your armor?" Hassan asked, stepping back to examine the simple clothes, jeans, work shirt, boots worn from walking long distances. "I don't need it anymore," Kade replied. "I found something better." The something better was visible across the hilltop where the refugee camp had once stood. Instead of emergency tents and temporary shelters, Hassan saw permanent buildings, a school where children learned in their own languages as well as English, a medical clinic that specialized in trauma recovery, workshops where adults learned trades that would let them rebuild their lives, gardens where families grew their own food, a playground where children laughed in languages from a dozen different countries. Most remarkably, there were former enemies working side by side, Syrian government soldiers and rebel fighters teaching children together, Ukrainian and Russian families sharing meals, Somali clan members who had once fought each other, now collaborating on construction projects. "Welcome to New Haven," Hassan announced proudly. "Katya's the mayor now. Dr. Naziri runs the medical center. My mama teaches in the school." Kade walked through the community that had grown from seeds of hope planted in the darkest moments of human conflict. He saw former warlords teaching children how to read, ex-soldiers from opposing armies working together to build houses, families who had lost everything finding new reasons to believe in tomorrow. At the center of the community stood a monument, not to him, but to everyone who had chosen compassion over convenience, protection over profit, hope over expedience. The inscription read simply, "Heroes aren't born, they're chosen every day by everyone." "Dr. Vasquez is here," Hassan said, tugging Kade toward the research center. "She's been helping us design better water purification systems. She says the things you taught her about alien technology work even better for peaceful purposes." Elena emerged from the laboratory as they approached, her hair streaked with silver, but her smile bright as ever. "Kade, how was Central America?" "Progressing," he replied. 7 more camps have transitioned to permanent communities. The infrastructure projects are ahead of schedule." He paused, studying her face. "You look happy, Elena." "Happier than I ever was building weapons," she admitted. "Turns out that alien technology is much more interesting when you're using it to grow food in desert conditions and purify contaminated water than when you're making suits of armor." As they talked, Hassan noticed something else. Other figures approaching across the hillside. Adults wearing simple work clothes but moving with the quiet confidence of people who had seen combat. Some carried construction tools. Others had medical supplies. A few were leading groups of children. "Who are they?" Hassan asked. Kade smiled. "Former soldiers from a lot of different armies. They decided they'd rather build things than break them." Among the approaching figures, Hassan recognized faces he had seen on news broadcasts. Military officers who had refused orders to harm civilians. Pilots who had turned their planes around rather than bomb villages. Entire units that had chosen conscience over career. But there was one figure Hassan didn't recognize immediately. A man in civilian clothes, slightly older than Kade, walking with the careful gait of someone still recovering from injuries. "Is that?" Hassan started to ask. "Colonel Dumil," Kade confirmed. "Marcus. He's been helping design conflict resolution protocols for the UN. Turns out that understanding how to wage war efficiently makes you very good at understanding how to prevent wars from starting." The man who had once been Colonel Doom approached slowly, his expression carrying the weight of someone who had seen the cost of his own choices. "Kade," he said quietly, "the Morocco situation has been resolved. No casualties. The water rights dispute was settled through negotiation rather than force." "Good work, Marcus," Kade replied, and Hassan could hear genuine warmth in his voice. "How are you feeling about the diplomatic solution?" Dumil was quiet for a long moment, watching children play in the streets below, while their parents prepared dinner and discussed plans for expanding the school. "I spent so many years believing that superior firepower was the only language some people understood. I was wrong. Superior compassion is a much more persuasive argument." That evening, as the sun set over New Haven, Kade found himself sitting with Alexei on the hill overlooking the community. The boy had grown tall for his age, but his eyes still held the bright confidence of someone who knew the world could be better than it was. "Do you ever miss it?" Alexei asked, watching shooting stars streak across the clear sky. "The power? The ability to fly between continents in hours? To lift tanks with your bare hands?" Kade was quiet for a long time, watching children play in the streets below while their parents worked together on community projects. In the distance, he could see other hills dotted with similar settlements. Former refugee camps that had become cities, former enemies who had become neighbors, former victims who had become leaders. "I thought the suit made me strong," he said finally. "I thought being able to stop armies and level buildings was what being a hero meant. But real strength isn't about what you can destroy. It's about what you can inspire other people to build." Alexei nodded slowly. "And what have you built?" Kade gestured toward the community below them, but his meaning encompassed something larger. Across the globe, the New Haven model was spreading not through force or intimidation, but through example. Refugee camps were transforming into permanent communities. Veterans of different conflicts were working together on reconstruction projects. Children who had grown up in war zones were becoming teachers, doctors, engineers, leaders of a generation that understood the cost of violence and the value of peace. Most importantly, the principles that had guided Kade's time as the Protector had outlived the technology that made it possible. Military units around the world now included conscience protocols in their training, the understanding that superior firepower required superior restraint. International law had been rewritten to protect civilians during conflicts. A generation of children was growing up with the understanding that true strength meant protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. "I built the most important thing anyone can build," Kade replied quietly. "I built proof that there's a better way to be human. And then I taught other people how to build it too." As if summoned by his words, Hassan appeared at the top of the hill, carrying a small radio that Dr. Vasquez had helped him build. "Kade, come listen," Hassan called excitedly. "There's something on the emergency frequencies." Through the radio's crackling speaker, they heard the voice of a UN peacekeeping commander in Somalia. "Crisis resolved without casualties. Repeat, crisis resolved. Local leaders have agreed to peace negotiations. Children are safe. Refugees are returning home. We followed the Protector protocols throughout the operation." Hassan lowered the radio and looked up at Kade with eyes that no longer held the desperate fear of a war orphan, but the bright confidence of a child who knew the world could be made better. "Do you think there are other Protectors out there now?" Hassan asked. Kade smiled, thinking of all the people he had met over the past 2 years. Former soldiers building schools, ex-refugees teaching job skills, children who drew pictures of peace instead of war, diplomats who chose negotiation over force, soldiers who chose conscience over career. "I think," he said gently, "that there are Protectors everywhere now. You just have to know how to look for them." As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Kade Orion sat on a hillside with a child he had once carried through war zones, watching over a community built from the ashes of conflict, surrounded by people who had learned that heroism was not about having the power to save the world. It was about having the courage to inspire others to save it with you. The exosuit was gone. The technology that had made him superhuman had transcended into something better. The understanding that every human being carried within themselves the power to choose protection over control, hope over despair, compassion over convenience. And for the first time since he had first bonded with the alien technology, Kade felt truly, completely at peace. The future belonged to heroes who chose inspiration over intimidation. And there were more of them every day. The end. Legends aren't born, they're chosen. And the choosing never ends. Final inscription at the New Haven Memorial. What's a